Welcome to Clarity in Complexity, a podcast from Kenway Consulting where we unpack the real-world challenges facing modern organizations and explore how thoughtful, tailored solutions drives results. This is built for leaders navigating growth, regulation, modernization, and operational scale, especially in industries where complexity isn't optional. If you're making decisions that affect how your organization adapts to change, this conversation's for you. I'm Amy Wilkins, and this is episode 1. Navigating Healthcare's Regulatory Storm. Healthcare organizations aren't struggling because they lack strategy. They're struggling because regulation moves faster than operations can adapt. Between 340B changes, the Inflation Reduction Act, and most favored nation pricing pressures, compliance is no longer a policy issue. It's an operational one. And the organizations that treat it like a checkbox exercise, they're the ones that are scrambling. To help us make sense of all of this, I'm joined by Luke Otto, a leader in Kenway's healthcare practice, who works directly with pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, and health systems navigating regulatory and operational change. I'm also joined by Megan Phillips and AJ Rao, who have spent several years helping organizations turn compliance challenges into operational advantages. And today, they're going to share what's actually working for the organizations who are getting this right. Luke, Megan, AJ, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you, Amy. All right. Well, to start the conversation, Amy, AJ, Megan, I'm really looking forward to this, and all the listeners that we have. We figured it'd be best to set the stage and acknowledge where we are right now in the moment in time in the industry, and it truly is a fascinating time. It truly is a fascinating time, and that's not just rhetoric. For those who might feel and have heard this magic U word that everything is very uncertain right now, it's true. It's not just rhetoric, it is true. Last year, around this time, when the new Trump administration came in, the U.S. Economic Policy Uncertainty Index hit an all-time high. It was about 15% higher than in 2020, following the pandemic. And then in 2008, back in the Great Recession, about 90% higher than then. So it is right now. And maybe things are stabilizing a bit. There's still a tremendous degree of chronic uncertainty throughout the industry. Some things to acknowledge in what's happening now in this moment in time. I think folks who are listening to this are aware that we are no longer confronting a looming patent cliff, but we are entering into it as we speak. One of the steepest patent cliffs in the industry's history, at least since the early 2000s. Is being encountered now for the rest of this decade and through the first half of the 2030s. R&D is becoming more and more expensive and complex. The attrition-adjusted cost to develop one new novel asset is right now nearly $3 billion. And to give an example of the complexity of R&D, in the last 7 years alone, the amount of phase 1 clinical variables has risen by about 35%. So it is true. R&D is becoming more complex, more expensive. The rise of China and the rise of Asia at large. Asia truly is now the epicenter of the global innovative pipeline, at least for early research and development, surpassing now the US's share and Europe's share of early stage clinical molecules. And then it also brings us, on the note of China, it brings us to some other global factors, some macroeconomic factors, geopolitical pressures. Last year, we were experiencing lingering inflation. There's still today this chronic issue of affordability across the United States, and a very strange labor market. Is it strong? Is it weak? It's tough to tell, depending on what signal you reference. And there's no longer a threat of tariffs, it's the reality of tariffs. And that brings us into some of the conversation today about the legislative landscape, how to navigate it, how to respond, how to preempt it. With where we are right now, some of those core pieces of legislation, there's the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Even though it was enacted years ago, it's still very active today. Medicare Part D was redesigned. There are new inflation penalties for price increases that outpace inflation for Medicare. But then most notably, what people hear about in the news are the ongoing price negotiations. There are prescription drug advisory boards. This is the the wild west of really federated state level affordability boards, these PDABs at the state levels. 340B is a ballooning program, and it's caught in the midst, as we'll hear from Megan, in regulatory whiplash. There is most favored nation pricing or international reference pricing, and probably now, in my opinion, something that is going to be even more top of mind and is likely at the frontier of innovation as it relates to looming legislation is what's going to happen this year and next year with PBMs. There will likely be some decoupling of PBM compensation from drug prices. And in addition to that, organizations are beginning to contract, pharmaceutical organizations are beginning to contract directly with employers. Eli Lilly announced some news last week, and there will probably be many others that start to come out with these new models. So there's a lot that's going on right now to respond to and get in front of some of these legislative changes that are incredibly dynamic right now. And the last thing I'll say, just to put a cherry on all of this, is just last week to reiterate and emphasize how dynamic and fluid everything is right now. Last Friday, for not the first time, but the second time in the past 9 months, Vinay Prasad, the top vaccine regulator at the FDA, announced he is leaving the FDA as the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And that, I think, just speaks to the moment in time that we're in. There, again, back to what I led with uncertainty being at a fever pitch right now, there is so much to navigate. And we've had the opportunity for years now to work with different teams at different organizations in stitching together these operating models and these operating groups on, again, how to respond to and, to the best of our ability, preempt and shape some of this legislation, because it really is impacting pharmaceutical organizations profoundly today. So looking forward to it.
Thanks, Luke. I'd like to actually jump in there on that topic of operating model. That list was rather long that you just gave us in terms of what organizations are facing today. And a solid operating framework is crucial in this instance, in all instances, to respond to the world of constantly changing regulations. I get that, but when you talk about a good operating model or a good framework for regulatory response, bring that down to a one-on-one level for me. What does that mean? And maybe Megan, I'll ask you from your perspective, what does that mean?
Right, Amy. Most organizations are still treating change like a series of individual initiatives, a new regulation, a new system update, a compliance process change, but change is constant. And especially in biopharma and healthcare, those changes are rarely isolated. A good example is 340B. Organizations have been dealing with policy shifts, changing contract pharmacy rules, state activity, and ongoing litigation for years now. It's not a one-time initiative. It's something leadership is constantly adapting and managing change. And so where we see organizations being successful is when they do have a good operating model framework. And three things really come to mind when we're talking about a good operating model framework. First, it's having clear end-to-end accountability. Even though multiple functions are involved, market access, legal, government affairs, someone needs to own the outcome end-to-end. Second, separating policy interpretation from execution. Legal and government affairs help interpret a rule, but the business needs a solid structure to implement the change. And third, reusable operating structures like standing governance forums or a standard intake and impact assessment. So every new regulatory requirement runs through the same playbook. Leaders who have visibility into not just what the change is, but how much change the organization can absorb at any given time helps them to better be able to prioritize and sequence rather than overwhelming their teams.
That's really helpful, Megan, to kind of take that operating framework down a level into what it means. So end-to-end accountability, separating policy interpretation from execution, a reusable operating structure, and visibility into how much the organization can absorb from a change perspective. That's really helpful. And so now I'm going to ask another question. You take an operating framework and what that looks like in theory, Help me understand what that might look like in practice, and where have you or where have we seen it work and potentially not work?
Yep. What we've learned is that most regulatory programs don't break because teams don't understand the regulations or the rules. They break because accountability across the organization wasn't clearly defined from the start. First common failure point that we see is functional ownership getting confused with outcome ownership. Legal interprets the rule, the business runs the process, analytics produces the reports, but no one owns whether the whole system from end to end is successful. We see this a lot with IRA and MFP implementation, where interpretation and execution sit in separate parts of the organization, but there's no common overlapping operating model framework. A second challenge is accountability being implied rather than explicit. Everyone thinks someone else is driving the decision or owning the risk. And when the timeline tightens or something urgent happens, ambiguity shows up and people start to swirl. And a third breakdown that we see is when the governance structure works in a stable environment, but collapses under pressure. For example, in the 340B world, when policy is constantly changing, decisions can stall because escalation paths weren't designed clearly from the start. So what might look like an execution problem is really an operating framework issue.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you for bringing it down to an additional level. A lot of the problems that you mentioned, or the challenges or opportunities that you mentioned, are common amongst most programs that I see. So that was really helpful. So let me take it one step further. Once you step back, you design a solid operating framework, you have clear ownership, you have clear governance, you have clear decision rights. The next realization leaders often have is this: that same framework keeps hitting stress in the same ways. And that's where I want to go next. Because whether we're talking about 340B, whether we're talking IRA, what's coming up with MFN, most favored nation, and PBM legislation, the regulatory details change, but the operational pressure points don't. So maybe AJ, talk to me about your experience across programs like 340B, IRA, MFN. What common operational challenges keep showing up? And why does Kenway always start with this operating model framework we've been talking about instead of the regulation itself?
What you said is exactly right. The regulatory details do change, like we've mentioned at the front, and there's a lot of those details. But those operational pressure points, exactly as you said it, we get the same stresses in the same places over and over again. Where we tend to see organizations struggle isn't in designing adaptability to respond to this litany of legislation that we're seeing come out, but it's in sustaining the model and the framework that allows us to be successful. There are two, maybe three consistent signals, if we really want to boil it down, that we've seen in our day-to-day experience that indicate that things are maybe starting to break down.
I'd love to hear about what those are, AJ, because I think I know, but your perspective and your experience here is paramount.
Yeah, and to give some context to our listeners, Megan and myself, we've been working with leading pharmaceutical organization for the past 2.5, almost 3 years now, across IRA drug price negotiation preparations, across 340B regulation preparation response, and the like. Through that experience, we've seen that these teams go through multiple waves of regulatory response. And when the next change comes, or when the next piece of legislation comes, or the next thing to respond to shows up at the doorstep, people, they're tired. People get tired. The energy to respond just isn't there in the same way because they just keep getting hit with wave after wave of thing. And they want to respond. They want to put 100% of their effort in, and they're passionate about how and the quality in which they present themselves or present their deliverables. But again, human nature being what it is, we have to design these frameworks, these models, or these environments in a way that people get a break. People can step back and someone else can step into this role and lead and contribute and own without any lapse in delivery quality, timeliness, etc. That being said, another one of the stress points that we see is role confusion. Megan talked about this a little bit earlier. When you first set up a model, things are clean and crisp, and people remember exactly what their role is and what they should be doing, what they own, what they're contributing on, what they are accountable to, etc. But as priorities shift, as new waves of things come in, sometimes those roles shift and people have to wear different hats. But then when that gets layered on top, again, more things come in, priorities shift. Those lines that we had clearly delineated early up front start to blur. And now people forget, what is it that I'm responsible for? What was I supposed to be doing? Oh, wait, I'll just take this thing. That's great that there's that kind of adaptability. But again, there has to be an opportunity to pause and say, Amy, this is what you're responsible for. Luke, this is what you're responsible for. If we need to shift, let's make sure that we're making a distinct decision that everyone's aligned on, because otherwise things are going to get messy real quick.
Yeah, AJ, I couldn't agree more. I mean, in a program for regulatory change or programs in general, starting with a clear set of roles and responsibilities can absolutely make or break a program and the success of it. So that was one I was going to highlight, but you did it first. So thank you. What else do you see?
I think to keep this list of 3 going, adoption drop off after go live. And in our case, right, Megan and myself, again, sometimes you're talking about go live, meaning we've submitted something to the government for their review. There's a model, there's a framework, there's a data package due, etc. In this case, that's what we mean when we say go live. Once that immediate urgency to create a deliverable or send something off to a regulatory agency, once that's off or out of your outbox and that immediate pressure is gone, I think there's a tendency for people to relax. But in this kind of environment, again, what Luke described at the very top of this conversation, it's not a one and done. You can't just ship something off and then assume that you're done and we're free and clear. There's a next thing coming, certainly. We don't know what the next thing is, but we know it's coming. So once that pressure is gone, or when people shift roles, or there's reorgs that happen frequently across especially large organizations, execution, usage, all of that kind of stuff that we set up at the beginning of an engagement can become inconsistent, and the organizational structure can kind of start to drift.
I think that's a really important point, AJ, because operating models don't get distressed by regulation or external factors. They get stressed by people transitions. And the durability of the operating model shouldn't depend on just the individuals in the room. It should be set up for success no matter who's in the room, right? And I think another thing that leaders sometimes underestimate is that the impact of these programs evolves over time. You see this a lot with 340B and IRA, where policy shifts and enforcement activity can dramatically change the scale of the program. That's why the operating model needs to adapt. Structures need to change if the risk profile is evolving.
AJ, Megan, thank you so much for taking us through, setting up your operating model, what the framework could look like, breaking it down for us in terms of practical application, really showcasing some of the challenges and the opportunities to that practical application. I suppose the next question that our audience might have is, so when it's working well, what does that look like? What does success look like? What does that feel like? And maybe I'll ask you, Luke, to answer that one. I know you've been involved in a lot of this. What does that feel like to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, right now, it's, again, going back to what we led with, we know that the external environment is filled with uncertainty. Some folks might say this chronic or ambient anxiety. And so if you can bring clarity and structure internally to how a team operates, that I think is the most important thing to acknowledge about what it looks like, what it feels like. I'll tell you in terms of what does good or what does success feel like. Well, we've seen it evolve over time. AJ, Megan, from different domains, I've been there with them. We've felt it where we've entered into environments and teams you have no idea where to begin. Who's doing what, when, how. But we're in, for example, with the Inflation Reduction Act and these ongoing price negotiations that occur on an annual basis. It's been beautiful to see the structure that AJ has spearheaded at one of our clients, where now, to Megan's point, what she said about folks coming in, moving on, naturally you'll have people move on in and out of certain positions or in and out of certain roles. And you'll work with different teams as well. There are all kinds of different drugs, different groups we work with, from R&D, medical affairs, medical writing, regulatory affairs. And it's a true playbook where that everybody operates from the same set of codified rules and processes. And now it's a very, I would say, well subscribed model that we have in place, and nobody operates, at least internally, with the same type of uncertainty, anxiety, and so forth that the externally other folks might be experiencing. But in like I said, it's been a beautiful thing to see unfold over the years with the IRA, with one of our clients, and how these teams come together and operate cross-functionally very, very well with one another. Megan, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I guess I would say if there's one takeaway, it's this: to focus on the structure before the solution. Design once and then adapt over and over and over again.
That's great. And thank you for painting that picture, Luke. I love that you have the one takeaway, Megan. I'm going to ask you, Luke, and you, AJ, as well. AJ, if I'm a leader listening to this, in the audience, what's the one takeaway that you want them to take back?
If I had to give a leader one takeaway from this conversation, Amy, I would say treat regulatory response as an enterprise capability. Many organizations can fall victim to treating each of these individual regulations as one-off projects. That's dangerous. Mm-hmm. The environment now that we are in demands repeatable capabilities, not temporary responses. So build structures, to Megan's point, to Luke's point, build structures that allow teams to respond consistently across multiple regulatory programs with flexibility, with adaptability, and with sustainability.
Mm-hmm. That's a great one, AJ. To add to that, Amy, it's organizations have incredible experts in these fields. Some of the roles that I just described, medical affairs, regulatory affairs, public affairs, marketing experts, and so on and so forth, market access. Treat what AJ just described as this regulatory response strategy. Treat it very seriously, with the role of the team or the function to stitch all of those folks together. Don't bypass the importance of that role in bringing everyone together to, again, operate on the same page, because these are incredibly important decisions that are made to respond to these strategies. And don't do it alone. Don't do it alone. Don't recreate the wheel, to use that proverb. There is so much out there that organizations can draw from external expertise to at least get some help early on to stand this up, and then run with it afterwards. But I would strongly recommend organizations don't go it alone, and that they look to organizations like Kenway or otherwise who can help you with this.
This has been very insightful. Thank you, Luke, AJ, and Megan, for your time and for sharing the knowledge that you've gleaned over the past few years. One of the things that I'll say that I heard today is organizations that thrive in this environment aren't really predicting the regulatory shift. They're building to absorb the change as it comes. That's not just an operational efficiency play. It's strategic confidence. That's what I heard from you all today, and I appreciate it, and I hope our leaders appreciate it just as much.